Welcome back to In the Arena. I'm your host, Jonathan Stein. We're talking to young alums of the Goldman School of Public Policy, UC Berkeley, about the huge impact they're having on their policy fields. They are quite literally in the arena. Today's guest is Nicholas Alexander. Nicholas has over 10 years of experience in nonprofit and public administration, workforce development, criminal justice reform, and community and labor organizing. Today, Nicholas is the executive director of the Reentry Success Center in Richmond, California, where he provides wraparound services to folks returning to the community from jail and from prison, and to their families. Welcome.
Thanks.
So I don't think all of our viewers are going to know what reentry means. So why don't you start by telling us, when you're leading the Reentry Success Center, what does your population look like?
Well, just to clarify the term reentry, so people think about reentry as the process that begins when someone is released from jail or prison. It actually starts many months and years in other cases before the release from custody. So as soon as someone is charged with a crime, some folks are actually brought into custody at that point rather than released to return to court at a later date. And so at that point, there's things that can begin to happen in that person's life that will affect them for the rest of their life. So, for example, if you or I were detained for a crime, or maybe even for something civil, right, like in the case of immigration, we may lose our job. Our kids might miss us. You know, our families might not know where we are, and we have no way to contact them. So there's things that can really affect your psyche, affect your finances, affect your family life, that go on for the rest of your life. So when we talk about reentry, we really have to look upstream and see what are the things that are really going to affect you later in life. So reentry, it begins with when you're charged with a crime, and of course what happens following that allegation. What that means in terms of population, right, is not only people who are convicted of a crime, but people who were simply charged or with something civil. So our population at the Reentry Success Center looks like America. There are so many folks who end up part of the system of mass incarceration or indirectly impacted by it. And that's what I mean by families impacted when someone is detained. So if I go to jail, my son is going to be hugely impacted by that system and how it's impacted my life. So the families who are impacted by incarceration are welcome to become members of the center. And that's sort of a new thing for our community, for the reentry community, is bringing the families in to receive services as well as those who are actually being held in custody. So when I say our population looks like America, I really mean it. So it's women, it's men, it's all sorts of ethnicities and races.
And it's kids, because you're dealing with families.
And we have kids who come in as well. Less kids. We tend to work with partners who are specialized with providing services to kids, but certainly they're welcome to become members and get access to those partnerships that we have in place. I think the unifying factor, or I would say the thing that really ties most of our members together, is really economic status. And so what you find, of course, in America is that folks who tend to get detained, people who are put in prison, who are put in jail, overwhelmingly are low-income folks. Does that mean that they're committing certain crimes more than people with more income? In some cases, yes, but what we see over the spectrum, especially with drug crimes, right, is not that there's a higher prevalence of those those acts in folks who are lower income, but really that it's prosecuted more, or that it's policed more.
Policing is different
in communities of color and low income communities.
Yeah.
That's right.
Give us an example, a hypothetical one if you want, of someone returning to their community and to their family after a period of incarceration, and all the myriad changes, and challenges they're going to face when they reintegrate.
Sure. So when somebody comes home, there's some differences between if they're coming home from jail, which is usually at the local level, county level, and a prison, which can be at the state level or the federal level. And of course, the more severe crimes, right, are charged by the federal government and down the chain. So we primarily work with folks from the county jails because that's the way sort of California, our state, is structured in terms of the services that we provide. But we do get folks from prison and at the state and federal level as well. And when they're coming home, folks normally only have access, if they haven't received abundant support from their family, what they had at the moment that they were detained. So the clothes on their back and a few bucks from the government, usually for transportation and a meal, and then they're sort of put out. Usually put out at odd times of the day, either very early in the morning or very late at night, so that, at least in our area, to avoid a whole lot of contact, or not even necessarily contact, but avoid the scene, right, of people being released from prison, because that can, right, create some fear amongst the community.
Yeah.
And so there's difficulty even there, right, with then accessing places to stay, services immediately upon release, which is something that we've been working on for a number of months in terms of getting people immediately to services. And that's really critical, because what we find is the first 72 hours when folks are released is extremely important. And the reason is that we actually find a lot of recidivism takes place in that first 72 hours. If you can imagine being, in a concrete cell, bars for, months, years at a time, and then all of a sudden you're back into a community and there's so many things going on, you can really get overwhelmed, and people can make bad choices in that state if they don't have proper support, either from family or from the community, the wider community. And we really work to make sure that takes place, that those services, that support is in place for folks coming home. When folks come home, the obvious need right away is housing. And the Bay Area, of course, has a housing crisis, particularly for very low-income people. Not affordable housing, very low income, which are two different things. So we try to get folks housing. And in many cases, there aren't permanent housing choices available. What that means is folks are going into shelters. And unfortunately, our shelters are overwhelmed as well. And so sometimes folks aren't even able to get immediately into a shelter bed. Sometimes there's extra cots that become available, or sometimes folks simply have to be outside. And as you can imagine, being outside, whether it's summer or winter, but particularly winter, it creates all sorts of additional stress, in which case people can make bad choices. After sort of housing is secured, then the next thing, of course, right, becomes about your income. You need money to support yourself, and so the search for a job and really a career is one that can be quite difficult for somebody who has a conviction on their record. It's difficult for folks who come from neighborhoods where the schools aren't great to begin with, and secondly, that may not have gone on to get higher education, or may not have had very steady job histories in the first place. But once you get that conviction on your record, like some other things, it sticks with you for a very long time. And fortunately, California is sort of leading the way with some changes at least the Bay Area is leading the way with some changes to what employers do and do not look at, particularly public employers, but San Francisco, as one example, has gone to make that background checks for private employers also something that's done in a process where folks who have a conviction get a fair shot at those employment prospects. So we work on addressing some of the barriers to getting into employment, some of the barriers that exist to getting education. And once we start people into those processes where they're able to find housing, they're able to find some income, there's a host of other issues that come up. And so at the Reentry Success Center, we sort of order our services in 8 general areas. And those are family, finances, education, employment, housing, health and wellness, benefits, and legal services.
So California has made real progress in recent years in breaking down the over-incarceration state. So in 2011, it passed something called realignment that moved a lot of low-level felony offenders from state prison to community and county supervision, so they're closer to services and their families. In 2012, we passed Prop 36, which reformed 3 strikes. In 2014, we passed Prop 47 that reclassified 6 low-level felonies as misdemeanors. And last year in 2016, we passed Prop 57, which makes it easier for folks incarcerated to get parole and take some power that was previously given to prosecutors and gives it to judges instead. Tell us about how those changes, either individually or as a whole, has affected the community you serve.
Well, I think just to be very brief about it, it means we have a lot more business, right? Yeah. So a lot of folks, instead of sitting in a cell, are back in the community, which is a great thing. As we kind of touched on, when folks are in jail, in prison, a lot of times more harm is being done than good. And in terms of discouraging certain behaviors, it can be much better accomplished out in the community with the Reentry Success Center than if they're in jail. I think in terms of criminal justice reform, where we really want to go is, I think, less about what happens on the back end. We kind of have those answers, and really more about the front end. As we kind of talked about earlier, reentry starts way earlier than when you're getting out of jail. And so a couple of things in particular, the bail system. Right. A lot of legislators are already kind of aware of the discrepancy there. With folks who have money, they're able to get out. Folks who don't have money are not, sort of regardless of the risk they pose.
Right, 2/3 of people in county jails nationwide are pretrial, which basically means they haven't been convicted yet. They're sitting there because they can't pay their way out while they're awaiting adjudication.
That's absolutely right, and I mean, the fact that they're in county jail tells you these are low-level crimes, and usually these folks would happily come back to court if that meant they didn't have a risk of going to jail, as most people would. And so the bail system, as it's currently in place, again, does not accomplish necessarily the goal that it sets out to do. But what it does do is create some of these adverse impacts on people's lives. They lose their jobs. Kids who need their parents, right, for supervision, for love, aren't able to have that contact. So that really needs to be reformed, and fortunately there's some stuff out there that's happening. There's some other states that are really ahead of California on bail reform, but that's a great place to start. Another thing that needs to happen, even actually a little bit ahead of bail reform, is how we look at drug use and substance abuse. And right now, there's a lot that's happening in terms of punishment of drug abuse, right? And we tend to look down on folks, right? But what we have to recognize that addiction is a sickness. You don't look down on somebody who has a flu because they're not able to go to work, right? Because they're cranky, right? When someone has a sickness, it's a public health issue. It's that simple. It's a public health issue. And when we start treating people as though they have a sickness and an illness that can be cured, that can be rehabilitated, rather than it's somehow a personality trait that is going to be with them forever and that they deserve to be punished for, we'll be much further along, because many people, I would venture to say the majority, although I can't cite a statistic, commit crimes when they're using drugs. They're not using their right mind. If they weren't drunk, if they weren't high, they probably wouldn't be doing the thing that they were doing that's illegal, or trying to get money to feed that addiction. So if we can deal with that addiction, if we can deal with the illness, then we'll really do a lot of good in progressing towards eliminating or reducing some of the crimes that take place, particularly property crimes.
It's an upstream solution to those problems.
It's an upstream solution. We'll save a lot of money. We'll save a lot of lives.
The value of this work doesn't just lie in helping people heal, getting them back on their feet, helping families and communities come back together. From a more hard-boiled numbers approach, all of this work reduces recidivism, right? So California has one of the highest recidivism rates in the country. According to one Pew report, it has the second highest in the country. Does the recidivism rate you see among your client population go down because of the services you're able to provide them?
Well, it's a little too early to tell right now. There's a number of ways to look at recidivism, whether you look at convictions as the definition versus arrests, whether you look at a year or 3 years. We're a little bit over a year old, but all the folks that we work with didn't come in on day one, right? So me being a GSPP graduate, I'm familiar with how to make sure that our statistics are pretty accurate, and so we're not ready to really compare to a larger sample or larger population. But what we do know about recidivism is that absolutely it goes down when you have the proper supports in place, and that's what we're doing at the center.
California's recidivism rate is somewhere around 55–60%, and the recidivism rate, that's a return to prison for a felony offender within 3 years. The recidivism rate for folks who receive substance abuse and mental health counseling after release is around 20–25%, right? So the sort of services you're providing don't just help people heal, they save society, to be cold-hearted about it, money in the long run, and make communities safer.
Right, so whether you are doing it for moral and ethical reasons, whether you're doing it for fiscal reasons, there's all sorts of reasons that this makes sense.
The investment is worth it.
And, what I would say also is that if we're honest with ourselves, right, in many cases we're doing more harm by putting folks into jail and prison than we are good. And so we have to ask ourselves as a society, what purpose are we serving with our system of criminal justice? And I think for too long, it's been really about punishment. And not really making our society better, not really about justice, not really about fairness and ethics. It's been about punishment. And if we intend to punish someone, why are we punishing them, right? And what do we intend the punishment to accomplish? And if we look at those things and they don't match up, right? If we want punishment to prevent, right, this sort of behavior from reoccurring, and it's actually making it reoccur more frequently, well then we're working backwards, right? So when we talk about recidivism, when we talk about reforms to criminal justice, we really need to look on the front end of this and say, hey, some alternatives to incarceration are really in order here.
How does your Goldman education, how does having an MPP in your back pocket affect your work on a day-to-day basis?
Sure. So being in a services type environment is not the typical career trajectory for a Goldman graduate, and I'm very aware of that on a daily basis. But I'm so glad to have that education, because when I leave my office, right, and I have to go advocate, whether it's before the city council or whether it's before the county supervisors or even in Sacramento, right, individual stories, right, anecdotal evidence only goes so far. And when the rubber hits the road, right, folks want to see facts, they want to see statistics, and they want to see really in-depth policy analysis. And so I have it, and I can give it to them. And also, when I need to be critical about some other policies policy proposals that are coming out to make things better, I'm able to do that too. So on the day-to-day with the center, it's less important to implementing certain models, aside from just being an analytical thinker. And it's more important about being able to affect a larger systems change.
So before you came to Goldman, you were a labor and community organizer. And I think that's an unusual profile for a lot of Goldman students. We're sort of, supposedly anyway, more likely to hit the spreadsheets than hit the streets. I thought of that in advance. I thought it would.
That's clever.
I thought it would come off better than it did. So how do you think having an organizing background made you a different or more well-rounded, perhaps, Goldman student? And how does having an MPP provide value in an organizing context?
I think whether it's an organizing background or it's services or it's marketing or any really sort of professional experience is great to have coming into graduate school, because it gives you a better perspective on how you might use the skills that you are attaining. And it gives you perspective and focus on what you want to learn about. And in my case, with organizing, right, and labor organizing specifically, it helped me to sort of focus on what I wanted to achieve here. And in a university as big, with so many resources and so many bright minds, to figure out who do I need to talk to, right, and who do I need to sort of follow around and try to urge them to be my mentor. So, of course, for me, I ended up at the Labor Center a lot, which is a wonderful resource here on campus. I ended up actually over at the School of Economics a little bit, and trying to learn more of the skills that I needed to have effective counterpoints to what I heard from my opponents when I was doing labor organizing. And so, sort of on the flip side of that, right? If one was going into organizing, which I still do a fair amount of community organizing, right, with the reentry population, it's still important to have those same skills. Excuse me, the Goldman skill set, in the sense that, right, hitting the streets is not enough. It's good to rile people up. It's good to get people aware of the issues, but that's not enough, right? We need answers. We need specific proposals, and what you find is that a lot of the answers do exist, and I was even surprised by the amount of answers that already exist after coming to Goldman and reading all these great papers and meeting all these great professors. And so you need the organizing and the policy analysis to be more integrated. And if all the analysts are hitting the spreadsheets and in their offices, and all the organizers are in the streets and they never talk, well, we
everyone's
get
less effective.
Donald Trump.
So lots of young advocates, activists, organizers that I speak with assume that if they're going to take their work and their advocacy to the next level, they have to go get that JD. That's their default answer. How would you respond to someone in that situation and convince them of the value of the MPP instead?
Sure. Well, I'm married to an attorney. I think they're great people.
You're speaking to one right now.
I'm speaking to one right now.
But I put the MPP first in my MPP JD.
Oh, okay. Well, that's encouraging to know. So what I find when doing this work is that the number of folks with an MPP who really have a good grasp of statistical analysis, policy analysis, are few in number, and the number of attorneys can fill up dozens of rooms, right? And of course it takes great attorneys to be effective, but it also takes great analysts. And so not only does that mean that analysts are needed, right, or policy folks are needed, it also means you kind of have your choice of jobs, right? So if you're in demand, you're in demand, and you can kind of choose where you fit in, and you can also sort of move up the ladder pretty rapidly, I think. And so I think that's a great reason. I also think that attorneys have to work in a much more sort of rigid framework, in the sense, right, we have to work within the law as it exists. And policy analysts, we don't have that same framework that, I mean, of course we have restrictions, but there's a little bit more room for creativity. And I think for somebody at least like me, I need a little more space to be loose.
I think attorneys are more likely to operate with a built-in set of limitations in their head because of what the law says or they think the law says.
Absolutely.
Yeah, you have more room to roam, I think, and think creatively. Thanks so much for joining us. Sure. It was really a pleasure. Thanks very much for tuning into In the Arena. Check us out next time.